Good morning, good afternoon. Going to get started in just a moment. All right, good morning, good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, 12 Ways AI Can Optimize Your Asset Management Strategy. As a technology solutions provider to the public sector for 15 years, Triad Technology Partners is helping our customers keep pace with the rapidly advancing technologies available. We recognize that we, collectively, are at a critical point in time with AI. Our goal with this webinar is to provide you useful content to consider as you are planning your own first steps into AI, so to close the gap before the gap becomes unmanageable. Triad has been a longstanding partner and advocate for IBM technology solutions in the public sector. And with that, we have consolidated a panel of experts in the IT public sector and IBM space to share their knowledge and insights with you today. Should you have any questions throughout the presentation, please do not hesitate to ask by clicking on your Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. We will also close today's session with a questions and answers session with our panel, and we look forward to that discussion. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you one of our customers, the Director of the Department of Judicial Information Technology at the Virginia Supreme Court, to kick off today's webinar. Welcome, Mike Riggs, and thank you for joining us. I'll transition over to you.
Thank you, Kristen. Good afternoon, everybody. The Supreme Court of Virginia has started the process of identifying use cases and outlining a roadmap for a governed AI infrastructure, especially in the realm of generative AI. Webinars like this one presented today will offer great insight into the growing capabilities and possibilities that may align with the plans you have for your shops. Triad is a woman-owned, highly trusted small business based in Virginia. Beyond being a software and services reseller, Triad serves as a strategic partner for agencies and departments seeking modern, adaptable solutions. By leveraging their expansive partner network and state-owned cooperative contracts, Triad identifies innovative and efficient procurement pathways. With 15 years of experience operating in and around the Commonwealth, they focus on connecting clients with emerging and established technology leaders and service providers. As IBM Gold partners, they are proud to present today's discussion. Artificial intelligence is a topic on everybody's mind, and for good reason. In this session, we'll explore real-world examples of how AI is reshaping industries, from chatbots delivering instant personalized interactions to predictive analytics driving sustainability and asset management across sectors. With that, the potential of AI is transformative. By the end of this session, I hope you will leave with fresh ideas and actionable strategies for harnessing this powerful tool. Today's speakers, Melanie Gilbert and Deb Walker, are esteemed industry leaders who will guide you through key questions to consider as you approach 2025. These insights will help you empower and transform your teams. Let me begin by introducing our first speaker. Melanie Gilbert is an executive partner with IBM Consulting, leading a team of technology experts dedicated to helping the Canadian federal government fulfill its mandate to better serve citizens through technological innovation. She takes great pride in her team's success in delivering and expanding IBM Canada's most strategic service engagements. As a recognized authority in AI, Melanie is a sought-after speaker who has presented as both a keynote and panelist at prestigious events, including the Public Sector Network, the Financial Market Infrastructures, and Forward 50, a leading forum for public innovations. Melanie's passion for education extends beyond her professional work. As an adjunct professor at the University de Milan and Schema Business School in France, she has taught master-level courses on AI in government. Her leadership also shines in mentorship and advocacy. As an active member of Advancing Women on IBM Consulting, as well as Women in Technology, she mentors and inspires consultants and executives alike. Her contributions were recognized in 2021 when she was nominated for the esteemed IBM Judy Hoover Award a tribute to her efforts in advancing women in the tech industry. Melanie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mike. What a great introduction. I'm just going to start my video here. Hello, everyone. This is such a pleasure to be here. So the purpose of this, the presentation that I'm about to get into is around AI for government. So if we could get to the next slide, please. What I'd like to do is actually start with a bit of level setting on what do I mean by AI? So if we look at the left-hand side of this slide, we are looking at traditional AI models. AI has been around since the 1950s. It's been around for a very long time. What's really changed in the past couple of years is this whole concept of foundation models and and generative AI. So let me explain a little bit of the difference between the two, so that when we speak about AI, you'll have a good sense as to what we're talking about. So if you look at the left-hand side, we're talking about traditional AI models, and I'm sure many of you have encountered that. So if you think of those CAPTCHAs that you often are trying to figure out if you're a person or a robot, right? So is this a car? Is this a stop sign? Is this a cat? And so what you're essentially doing is labeling data. So essentially the traditional AI models is really individual siloed models. So that's what is one of the challenges. Right? So for every task, a particular AI model is typically built on this labeled data, like what I just talked about. So task-specific training for each model is incredibly expensive. So when I used to run AI projects for some of my government clients, I'm talking like 7 years ago, 80% of the cost was in that manual effort, that manual labeling effort of the data. So some of the challenges around that is that it's not really transferable. Like once you've actually done that labeling for a project, you then have to restart the process for any kind of new project. And so it's not scalable. So what we were finding is that many projects that were using this traditional machine learning labeling technique would stop in the pilot stage, right? It was not very easy to scale because of the cost. It was incredibly manually intensive. So lots of human effort, and the cost was really just spent on the labeling the data. If we look at the right-hand side, now we're looking what's really changed the game, if you will, is this concept of foundation models. So this is an illustration of how generative AI is built. So unlike traditional AI, foundation models don't begin with human labeled data, right? They are actually pre-trained on massive amounts of computer-generated labeled data. So specifically, instead of building each model for a specific task, foundation models are massive multitasking models that can be applied to many different tasks, many of which maybe they were never even trained for. And you've also used this, like, so if you think of ChatGPT, right? Like, I mean, everyone has probably used ChatGPT, came out a couple of years ago. And so these are models that were pre-trained, right? And it was pre-trained on all the internet data. So these models don't require supervision or labeling. Due to the amount of data used, however, the cost of that is really around the graphical processing units, so GPUs and memory. So it's really in the hardware and the software. So many companies aren't really creating their own foundation models, but they may want to leverage existing foundation models and then connect them to their own proprietary data, which provides, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in a few slides. So what do some of these, initially where we've seen a lot of the value from these just out of the box foundation models, and you've probably used them yourself, is, summarization of text, conversational knowledge, content generation, and that Q&A question answering, right? So if we can go to the next slide, we'll talk about, I mentioned it already. Oh, okay. Yeah, so if we talk a little bit about the next slide, exactly. So every organization has its own language. So I've kind of touched on this already, where the value is really in the independent data within an organization. So 72% of top performing CEOs agree that having the most advanced generative AI tools, gives an organization a competitive advantage. But if those tools are not grounded in the enterprise's unique context, and if you think of government in particular, right, you may not get the full benefit if you don't have that context. So what I like to say here is, like, every company has its own language. So I'll give an example. Take the word dressing. So dressing for a grocery chain might mean salad dressing. For a hospital, it might mean like wound dressing. So having that context around the data is incredibly important. Data is really the lifeblood of any kind of AI project or application. we can go to the next slide, you'll see that one of the biggest, and this is from the Gartner, where is it here? Yeah, this is like the Gartner survey that was done in 2023. The top 3 barriers to implementation of AI techniques within an organization. The number 1 is estimating and demonstrating AI value. So really, the challenge is that a lot of companies and organizations and governments are struggling to deploy AI at scale. Why? Because they're not, their biggest hurdle is showing the value, in other words, the business case, right? So this is often more difficult in governments, even in the private sector, because their mandates are often more difficult to measure, right? And they're not always motivated by financial savings, which is one of the reasons why I love working with governments so much, because a lot of the objectives are not necessarily based on financials, but it's about, improving citizen experiences and lives. So one thing that sets successful AI leaders apart is confidence in their ability to customize their AI efforts for optimal value. So this doesn't mean an organization must build its own models from scratch, because as we just discussed, it can be very expensive. Instead, it can adapt existing AI models by leveraging the one thing that nobody else has, their proprietary enterprise data, which is the most valuable asset that a company has. So every AI vendor has access to public information, right? So if you think, like I just talked about how ChatGPT is essentially using all of the internet's, like if you go to ChatGPT 3, I think it takes up to 2021, right? All the internet's knowledge until then. But they also have access, and that's what they've been using to create these platforms. But there is a barrier to continuing. Like after that, like where is that value? Where is that data coming from? What they don't have is the proprietary enterprise data. And that is the piece of the puzzle that's really missing, right? So if you think, like, just to give you a really good example, GPT-4 was trained on 0.5 petabyte of data. JP Morgan Chase has a potential training data set of 150 petabytes. So exponential. Now, does it mean that, you're going to use all of that data and that information to train a model? No, not necessarily. But if you understand that the value of that model or the value of that data, all of a sudden you can drive exponential value. So where is the value from these AI tools coming from? They're going to be coming from the unique understanding, that unique organizational language that every company has. So if we go to the next slide. So what is the value of AI, right? The value of AI is really important because every specific business decision doesn't necessarily need to be automated or innovated. So it's really important that every organization asks the right question, which is, what specific decisions are being automated or augmented or innovated? What financial value is being unlocked? What concrete impact can I get if I were to apply AI to this project or this area in my organization? So the next slide will ask some really key questions, right? So for instance, not every business challenge or desired outcome is fit for AI, right? Sometimes I feel like in working with some of my clients, it's like a hammer looking for a nail, right? So the 2 big questions that organizations need to ask themselves is, number 1, determine whether a broader strategic initiative or a particular business problem is a candidate for AI enablement. And number 2, start with an assessment of the overall data wealth, okay, as well as examine the actual problem that you're trying to solve for. So if you go to the next slide, as I mentioned before, data is the new oil. This is a very old quote. It was actually Clive Humbley, who's a UK mathematician and architect of Tesco's Club Card, that said this almost 20 years ago, all right? Data is the new oil. It's valuable, but if unrefined, it can't really be used. So it has to be changed into gas, plastic, chemicals to create something valuable if you discover oil. So it's just basically the same thing with data, right? Data must be broken down and analyzed for it to have value. So how do we drive value from data? There's 3 main approaches, right? So number 1, prompt engineering. So in this context, we're looking at a means for, proprietary data that is passed to the AI. So, users want an AI model to summarize call center conversations as an example. So the user can write a prompt. So summarize this conversation and attach the call transcripts to that prompt. So prompt engineering doesn't require altering the model itself. It's best suited for low volume generic tasks that are repeatable, right? Where it is reasonable to include the necessary context. So you're just basically prompt engineering is including additional context. Number two, and this one I find is incredibly valuable and powerful, is retrieval augmented generation, or otherwise known as RAG. So what that means is hooking up your AI model to your proprietary database. So the model can pull relevant information from your database when responding to prompts. So for example, an organization can give a customer service chatbot access to a database for company products. So all of a sudden, when you've got a client, calling, or a citizen calling into or using the chatbot, it is directly linked to the data and the answers within that proprietary database from the company. RAG does not require any permanent changes again to the model. It's just an integration. So it can improve accuracy and reduce hallucinations, but it can also increase response times. And then the final one is fine-tuning. So fine-tuning means giving AI enough additional data to change some of its parameters. So fine-tuning does permanently change the behavior of a model, so it adapts it to a particular use case or context. It's also faster and cheaper than retraining a brand new model. Okay, so instead of starting from scratch every time, what you're essentially doing is you're fine-tuning an existing model. So it requires a little bit more investment than prompt engineering and RAG. It is useful for turning a smaller model into an expert in a specialized domain. For example, an insurance company can fine-tune a model to master the art of processing new claims, as an example. So when AI models have access to proprietary data, they are grounded in a specific business context, which means their outputs are also grounded in that context. So you can take an AI model, fine-tune it with proprietary data, and that copy is unique to the company and it's proprietary. So the company owns the IP behind it and it runs its own infrastructure. So as a result, these models can produce more accurate and effective outputs than unaugmented, off-the-shelf models pulling from a general body of public data, such as ChatGPT. All right. So if we go to the next slide, the really cool thing about this is that government is a data billionaire. Out of all the different types of industry sectors out there, government has the most opportunity to gain, given the fact that they have, as one of my clients used to call it, silos of excellence, but there's so much data that the governments can leverage and use to the benefit of its citizens. So the next slide, please. But government is not like any other sector, right? So government it's really important for government to understand that its role, it's not like a Starbucks. So it faces the applications of AI, and there needs to be trust in the data and trust in the process. So when government is using AI, whether it's for its own applications or for policymaking, it's really important that people know where the data comes from, that it's open and transparent about how it's using the data, who is developing those models, and where that all comes from, right? So an OECD study shows that 41% of citizens do not trust their national governments. So this is a very important piece of information where governments need to take this into consideration. If they want organizations to use or to leverage or to trust the outputs of their AI models, it's important that there's trust, ethical AI, and transparency that's built in from the get-go. So if you go to the next slide, and government, as I just mentioned, like they have two major roles, unlike the private sector, right? Number one is policy and the other one is operations. So governments are held to a much higher standard than the private sector, as they are not just a consumer of AI, but they set the policies and rules for industry, right? So whereas the Starbucks needs to think about their share price or, their goodwill, government, you can choose not to buy a coffee at Starbucks, right? But government's applications of AI will affect every single citizen within that country. So it's really important that is taken into account because it has such a much wider impact than the private sector. So if you go to the next slide, let's talk a little bit. Let's start with policy. How is AI adapted or applied when governments are using AI for policy? So if you go to the next slide. So there's, AI adoption in government offers two really, really big opportunities that don't necessarily exist in the private sector. So number one It allows them to structure and analyze the huge amounts of data that they hold on citizens, and they can use it for social good. So this means they can quantify and reduce inequalities in outcomes as well as opportunities, right? So they can share that data with third parties who can create apps or services that, again, can improve the life of citizens by democratizing data. And I know in the US, there was a really, really big push a few years ago on that whole democratization of US data and making it public so that third parties could use it, while making sure like those parties keep the data private. So again, this is why trust, what we just talked about, is so important in the context of government. It also gives governments a unique chance to drive how citizens use and benefit from these technologies. So that's because governments are also responsible for role modeling the ethical use of AI, regulating how companies apply it, and educating citizens to be ready for the challenge. So if you go to the next slide, I'll give you a really good example. The Kenya government is a fantastic example of where this has been applied. The Kenya Lab has been consulting with the Kenya government to recommend and implement reforms that improves Kenya's ease of doing business rank, which is a really important metric for foreign investment. Okay, so this work has allowed Kenya to be the third most improved country in the world from a World Bank ease of doing business perspective. Actually, Kenya rose 44 places and is now 92nd in the world today. So how did they do this? This use case benefited from a significant amount of historical data on country reforms published by the World Bank every year. So what they did is they analyzed unstructured reports to compare countries, extract actions from similar countries, and allow analysts to run what-if simulations to forecast a query country ease of doing business posture. So if the country were to implement an interesting action from successful countries that were similar to the query at some point in the past. So essentially, Kenya said, listen, hey, these comparable countries in size and rank, they've adopted these policies. What if Kenya were to adopt these policies? What would it do? And by applying these what-if analysis and the outputs essentially allow them to select the best policies for the country, and they had a material impact on their ability to attract additional foreign investment into the country. So incredibly powerful if you think about how it actually helped the GDP of a country. So go to the next slide, please. This is one of my favorite reports. After this call, if you have the opportunity, if you go to Oxford Insights, the AI Readiness Index rankings, and what it does is it measures how ready is a given government to implement AI in the delivery of public services to their citizens. So it includes about 39 indicators across 10 dimensions. And it's just incredibly powerful. And it's actually a live, if you just do it, you can actually download the report, but you can also do it live on the website itself. And it'll show you like how are countries ranking in terms of their ability to adopt AI. And one of the biggest interesting things about this is allowing a lot of countries that have perhaps weaker economies to punch above their weight. And the biggest differentiator is countries who have adopted a policy, like a strategy. And most of the first world countries have, but it's also allowing many other countries to maybe skip over, right? To accelerate their AI adoption, and is having, as I just mentioned in an example, a really interesting output for that. So if you go to the next slide, now we'll talk a little bit about AI for government operations. So next slide. So heightened citizen demand for government services coupled with the need to do more with fewer services. Let's be honest, we're not getting more money to do more, right? It's leading everyone across government to embrace automation. I have this great example where I went to I'm not going to name the department, but one of the Canadian federal departments a few years ago, and they were really worried because, hey, we're unionized. You know, we don't want to improve automation. We don't necessarily want to. And they actually were very open about it in this meeting. And the question I asked them was, okay, so are you getting more money for more people? No. Do you expect your people to deal with more data or less data moving forward? More data. So you need to look at these technologies ASAP because no one's getting more people, right? And you can't just throw bodies at every problem. So it allowed them to shift their thinking. It's not going to necessarily take away jobs, but it's going to help It's going to help those who are using AI to accelerate. So that means, you know, more AI in government, much more. Government is on track to spend more on AI than any other industry by 2025, according to Gartner. So, you know, it's incredibly powerful, and governments are now really starting to really strongly look at how can AI have a measurable impact on my operations. So if we go to the next slide, there are also like risks, threats, and opportunities for large language model, and it's really, really important to think about this. So the efficiencies and effectiveness is one of the areas that is really, really important when governments are looking to be a consumer. So there's like these four main pillars, right? Efficiency, effectiveness, responsiveness, and accountability. It's important because when the use of AI in public sector can help governments increase the productivity with more efficient internal operations and effective public policies. Like that's key. Effectiveness is improving the policy making, which we just talked about, which is to understand as a decision-making process to plan, implement, and wherever relevant to alter public policies and programs within the OECD. Responsiveness is really the improvement of service delivery. And if you think about it, citizens are now used to a certain level of service delivery. When I go to my bank and I do my online banking, the bar is at a certain level. I'm now expecting to have that same service level with my government. I'm no longer satisfied with having to apply on on paper and triplicate or even like older web forms, right? So that whole service delivery, knowing me as an individual and having the ability to have the right services recommended to me as a citizen as I'm going through the different services, whether it's old age security or maternity leave or what have you, right? And then the last is accountability. And this one, to me, is one of the most important. It enhanced oversight and risk detection. So both within government agencies in high-risk areas and by external OECD agencies, okay? So if you think about accountability, the US is actually doing some really great work here. Just last year, the federal government in the United States had issued a decree where there is now a chief AI officer for most of their departments, which is critical. One of the challenges that I'm facing right now working with the Canadian federal government is that if everybody is accountable, nobody's accountable. So it's like, no, it's security. No, it's the CIO. No. So there's a bit of a challenge in terms of who's actually responsible for implementing AI. And it will actually, be accountable for actually seeing not only the risks, but also the successful completion of projects. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So business leaders are facing challenges in scaling, as I mentioned, right? So, and this is where I think, again, governments have an opportunity to be a shining beacon and exemplary example of how organizations, whether it's in the private sector or the public sector, can effectively implement AI. So one is around explainability, which is, making sure that decisions being made by generative AI are sufficiently explainable. As I mentioned, like, where's the data coming from? Who put it together? Like, can we trust that data? Is it public data, right? Ethics. So concerned about the safety and ethical aspects of generative AI. And that part of that is just making sure that how are we applying AI? For instance, within IBM, we have an ethics board. I've been through it multiple times for projects that I'm trying to bring to fruition. And they're an independent board. I had to go through it. One time my project was approved and the other time it was rejected because they thought that, there was some perhaps some issues around, how it will be used around. That one was around face recognition. So it's very interesting. And then bias, believe that generative AI will propagate and establish biases. If we're looking at historical data, because the historical data maybe had a bias, does that mean that we're going to continue escalating that bias moving forward? Who is actually creating those algorithms when you start doing the prompting and engineering or writing those algorithms, right? Making sure that there's diversity of thought and diversity of background for the people who are creating these AI applications. And then, of course, trust, which is super important. So believe that AI cannot be trusted. So it's really important that as organizations are building these models, that they're creating all these things, explainability, ethics, and bias, to create a sense of trust that citizens will use that information, or will be able to trust the outputs of those use cases. So you can go to the last slide. we talk a little bit about not every government is necessarily able to absorb full AI, right? So this is something I take my students through, but also my clients through, which is where are you on the maturity model, right? If you look at basic e-government all the way up to generative AI, you may not have the people, the processes, the ability to absorb these solutions. So if you have to sort of think about where do we fit as an organization along this maturity model, and then you can adopt the right strategies to be successful. You don't necessarily need to say, okay, my entire enterprise is going to be fueled by 100% Gen AI. You got to look at where does this make sense? And part of the ability to scale those AI models and making sure that they're successful is making sure that you've got the right people, the right processes, and the infrastructure in place to be able to not just be in what we call pilot purgatory, but find the right use cases and support to be able to take that to fruition. So with that, I want to thank you for your time. I know it was a little rushed, but you know, I had a lot to get through, and really appreciate the time. And over to my esteemed colleague, Deborah Walker.
Great. Thank you so much, Melanie, for that incredibly informative presentation. We are very fortunate to have two speakers today with some excellent insight for you. I'd like to introduce to you our second speaker, Deborah Walker. Deborah brings a close knowledge of real-world AI use case examples, and she is going to share some of these stories with us today and lessons learned along the way. Deborah has worked for IBM for the last 38 years and has been involved in several areas of the business, including data and AI and storage. She ran the global systems integrator space for 10 years as director of sales and successfully set up AI practices along the way. She currently works in the IBM ecosystem as a partner specialist. Deb, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much for the nice introduction. I'm going to have you turn to the next slide. And where I'm really going to begin this discussion is around where you begin your AI journey. And if you look on the right-hand side of this slide, there's a ladder there. And I will tell you in my experience that if companies and organizations did one thing that was of value to them, it's collecting, organizing, and growing their data. Just the process of unifying data has tremendous value. And that's really a lot of what we're seeing right now in the AI space. And so I always ask the customer, you know, what is your pain point? What is the thing that keeps you up at night? What do you think about improving, et cetera, et cetera? And like I said, 9 times out of 10, it comes down to just unifying their data and then trying as a next step to add AI to their applications, right? And you can read what I have on this slide. The next step is to automate workflows, replace workflows, and then finally AI does the work. So, you know, again, I know there's a lot of people that are just getting started with AI, and you have to think about where is the right place to start. So if you can move to the next slide, please. So a couple of things from a government use case perspective, I'm going to share some of the things that I've personally worked on over time. And I want to start with what is a use case anyway? Well, a use case is a pain point that an organization has really with a quantifiable outcome. And I'm going to show you some of those in later slides, but there are thousands of Watson X use cases that we've implemented in 6 continents. I've worked on a number of government ones around the world. But I'm going to start with a couple that I think are interesting for this audience. A number of years ago, we were called in because Obamacare was just getting started. And as you can imagine, there were lots of people calling in a very tight period of time. There were hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of agents taking calls and trying to get through this enrollment period. And it was like, how can we do this faster? How can we do this more efficiently? And what we discovered in that process by using Watson and AI, that 67% of the calls coming in were password reset. Because remember, people are just calling in one time to do this enrollment. So by just identifying that and using Watson to handle that, we were able to give the workload to level 2 and level 3 people so that more intense questions that were tougher to answer went to the right people. So that was one. And again, the ROI on that was very good because again, it really helped to move the whole process along. The other one, I'm going to have you move to the next slide, is work order intelligence with IBM Watson X. And this one we also did for an agency in the federal government that had a number of vehicles that they needed to maintain, trucks, planes, actually, buses, all kinds of vehicles. And the concern was, how do we ensure that these vehicles are maintained on a timely basis, that we have the parts available on time, in the right places. And so we were able to work to get that all done. And again, it really, really moved the process forward in a way that was way more efficient because there wasn't downtime for these vehicles. There wasn't frustration around not getting the parts. Everything was scheduled, so on and so forth. So again, a really good, a very good use case. And one that I'm also going to talk about that I don't actually have a slide on, but since we have Mike Riggs on, who's with the Virginia courts, this is one of my absolute favorite ones. I worked with a law firm in Spain and Portugal. So it's not necessarily a federal government use case, but what I like about it is it demonstrates a high volume of data necessary, again, to be pulled together to get an answer to something. And this particular law firm wanted to know, what cases do they win most often and why? And what cases do they lose most often and why? And the answer was a mystery to them. And I asked them, how would you do it if you were to do it manually? And they came back and they said, well, we'd hire a lot of people. We would sit them down, we'd give them access to our databases, and we have them start working on this. However, what would happen is, in short order, they would be pulled off to go work on something else. And the truth of it is, we'd never get to an answer. So I was lucky enough to have somebody available that was able to pull in the data that they would use. And we came in the next day and asked, where do you want to start? And they started with, we want to know what cases lose most often. And the answer was property management cases. And what was the reason? It turned out that it was the same judge who was always available for litigation. And it was a real aha moment for the firm. They had absolutely no idea with the thousands of attorneys that they had. And they brought the managing partner down to say to me, you brought value right now, and we haven't even done anything yet. So that's kind of an idea of how AI can really help pull data together in a way that makes sense and really give value to an organization. So I'm going to have you move to the next slide. So this slide talks a little bit about the most common generative AI tasks that are being implemented today. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but I'm going to talk about 3 of them. The first one is the retrieval augmented generation. And that one is really one that we use a lot around chatbots and things like that. So it's going out, asking a chatbot a question and retrieving the information necessary to answer the question. So we're seeing that one quite frequently, and we're also seeing that in the form of, conversational. So, and that becomes very important for different companies. So that's one that I'd like to point out. The other one that I would like to point out is the content generation. Just being able to generate content for specific things. Now, this says marketing campaigns and job descriptions. Job descriptions may be something in the federal government that would be important, but also around posts and articles and any kind of emails that need to go out the door. So that one is a big one. And finally, classification where again, a customer is looking at feedback from anywhere and trying to classify it. Is it good? Good feedback? Is it negative feedback? What is it? So we're seeing a lot of companies and organizations using these kinds of tasks on a regular basis. And I'll have you move to the next chart. This one, these are the common use cases. I'm definitely not going to go through these, but you know, one of the ones that came up when I talked to a Triad about the federal government was one on asset management and predictive maintenance. And I think the most important thing about this chart, which I think you guys will all get access to after this call, is not only does it show what the pain point is, but it also shows what the outcome is. And like I said, that is a very, very important part of understanding what you're going to do with AI. So in the case of asset management, which is in the last column, it talks about the fact that, you know, it reduced downtime by, I can't read it here, 43%. And so that's some of the things that we ask people to think about when they're looking at AI. If you put AI in place, what is your outcome going to be? What do you want it to be? So I'm going to have you go to the next slide. And I wanted to talk a little bit about starting your AI journey. And I get this question all the time. Where do we start? We don't even know where to go. So I always tell people, start with your pain point. What keeps you up at night? What do you think about? What would you like to see improved? And then what are your KPIs? What do you want to monitor? What do you want to measure? What's going to make you a more efficient, more effective organization? So again, that would be your second thing. And then what is the vision for the improvement? Like in a perfect world, if you were to wave your magic wand, what would you want to see happen with AI to improve your business? So, you know, again, in the case of the law firm that I talked about, they wanted information where they wanted to know what wins, what loses, and that would really help them in their business. So get that, you know, get an understanding of the vision. And then this one doesn't seem like it's as important, but it really is trying to get an agreement between the organization and the teams that they're working with as to what the pain point and the outcome is. A lot of people don't take that step, but I think spending time within the organization to say, what is the pain point? And again, what do we see as the outcome is really important before you even begin your AI journey. And then what are the key barriers to accessing the right knowledge at this time? What is it? Is it because the databases are all over the place? Is it because some of them are in a structured or an unstructured format? Is it that certain people can only have access where other people can't? Would it be better to have everybody have access? So this is another huge consideration when you're starting your AI journey. And then what are your key data sources? So where are they? So, you know, many times I will go into an organization and they'll talk to me about the databases. They'll talk to me about journals and other kinds of guides that they use out there that they want to pull in. And many times there's a lot sitting in somebody's drawer somewhere. So just trying to identify what those key data sources are and how you want to use them is really, really important. Then as Mel talked about, you know, are the sources trusted? Is there trust, bias, and explainability? You know, are those things important? Yes or no? And just trying to, again, lay out, in your opinion, where is the best place to get the best information that you want? And then how do you want to see your data? Do you want to get it in the form of a conversational response? Like, for example, I would like to know how many vehicles are on this particular lot today at 2 o'clock, or do you want to see it a different way? So again, a consideration. And then who will be using that AI product? Who do you want to have access to that? And how do you want them to use it? And how do you want to test your AI product for trust, bias, and explainability. I think that's always an important thing. Most of our customers end up using a POC to get a view of that, and I highly recommend that approach. And then what is your time frame? You know, is this a project that is going to take a long time, or is it a short-term thing? And what I would definitely tell you, and I think is so important, and the ones that I find are the most successful, are projects that are very focused and very narrow. So let's just say your process has 5 components to it. I highly recommend starting with the first part of that process and making sure that you're comfortable, that you're getting the response that you want from AI, and you're able to validate it. That will allow you to go to your next step. And then the last thing, the 12th thing, is when to engage. You know, when should you engage Triad and IBM in a design thinking workshop? So, you know, I've kind of taken you through some of these different use cases and considerations, but at the end of the day, you shouldn't feel like you have to do it by yourself. We offer with Triad design thinking workshops that help you answer all of these questions. It's a very nice, a very robust agenda that takes you through again, making sure that we understand what your pain point is and that we have agreement across the board. We do some activations so you can see AI in progress. In progress. And then lastly, we work to try to figure out, you know, what the outcome is and what the ROI is going to be for you. So again, you're not doing it by yourself. So that is sort of an overview of how you can start your AI journey with Triad and with IBM. And I am going to turn it back over to Triad for a close.
Thank you, Deborah, for your presentation. Wow, it's so interesting to hear of these examples of how AI has benefited organizations, particularly as they just begin their journey leveraging AI. As Deb mentioned, we do recognize that we're heading into the holiday season, but we are very much looking forward to connecting with all those who've attended today's webinar in January. So please look forward to hearing from us in the new year. And with that, we're going to transition over to our Q&A session. So again, we'd like to encourage anyone on the webinar, if you have any questions, it's a great opportunity to ask this panel specifically, anything that you have on mind. But let's kick it off here with the question we received. Are there any governance guidelines that are starting to come out, or is it too early for any such guidelines?
There are definitely guidelines. So if I can just jump in and Deborah, if you want to add to that, that would be great. But if you look at worldwide, there's a number of industry standards. So if you look at GDPR as an example in the UK, in Europe, there's a number of guidelines per country. So in Canada, as an example, the federal government has published its own policies and guidelines. And so it's really important. It's actually, I have a good friend of mine, it's her business is actually, she helps organizations ensure that as they are adopting AI, that they're actually following these international guidelines to say, yes, we are following, for instance, GDPR is around privacy and security, right? And so if a really good source to look at is even the OECD, the EU, it depends on in the US, there's a number of guidelines as well. So it's just checking them up. But there's absolutely a number of guidelines. And in that index report that I was talking about, the Oxford Insights one, I believe that there's also a list of the international standards and guidelines that are per country. So it depends on where, you know, if I assume if you're working with the in the US for like within government, whether it's state, local, or federal, I'm sure that there are a certain amount of guidelines that are already in place that you should be checking. If that's what you're looking for, if it's more of a guidelines to help, implement a project. There's absolutely suggested ways that you could, we sort of touched on it today a little bit in terms of what the process can be, in terms of those types of recommended guidelines for adopting a project, but international guidelines, there are many sources. I don't know if Deborah, if you had anything to add to that?
I don't. I think that's a great answer.
Yeah. Let me jump in in just a little bit. In the state of Virginia, the governor has issued executive order regarding AI. Very kind of broad guideline, if you will. Here at the Supreme Court, the justices, together with a very quickly put together AI team, established interim rules for generative AI use because we're concerned about the availability of the product, kind of open source, whether you're using Google or Copilot. It's all available in our browsers in one space or another. So we had to wrap some guidelines around that use to make sure we're protecting both what's going in and what's coming out as an interim step for some governance.
Great. Thank you for adding that, Mike. It's great to hear insight from Virginia. All right, let's move on to the next question. Who at the organization should be accountable for AI? Should it be one person or a stakeholder group that have equal say?
So I can talk about it from what I've seen. And I think it's, it depends truly on the organization. Usually it's a combination. It's a combination of the organization or leader of the organization that has the pain point, that has the need, in conjunction with somebody from the CIO's office that become the keepers, if you will, of the AI initiative. So that's what I've seen most often, but every organization is different. So it's maybe, it depends. It depends on the organization, but that's what I see most often. Mel? Your thought?
I'm aligned with that. I would say that it depends on where you are. Like I mentioned in my presentation, I think the US is actually ahead of the game. I think there was an executive order by President Biden, which essentially created a new role called the Chief AI Officer within the federal government for federal government departments. I feel like that's something that's lacking right now in Canada because, as I mentioned, if everyone's accountable, then no one's accountable, right? If everyone has the problem, no one has a problem. So it's really important that there is a role that's dedicated, that has budget and is incented to see a project from start to finish. Because otherwise, you can have somebody who will lead a pilot, but if you want like an actual program to launch, scale and be adopted across the organization, you need that executive sponsorship. There's a project that I'm working on right now with the federal government. I can't speak about it too much, but there is an accountable person, as Deb was saying, from the CIO office, and has support from the president of the department to create a scalable AI. Right now, we're going to start with a pilot, but the intention is for it to scale across the entire federal government as the standard for a specific service. So it's really important that you do identify like someone who is accountable. Typically it's within the CIO, but what I love about what the US is doing right now on the federal level is that there is an individual that's been named, which is this chief AI officer. And then of course there might be consortiums, like especially if you're doing a public-private arrangement where maybe you're working with educational institutions or with the private, there might be a public-private, depends on the business model. But so to Deb's point, there may be a consortium as well, but regardless, there should be someone accountable. Because I find that with the lack of accountability, usually these projects, maybe they'll get a pilot off the ground, but it'll just fizzle and die on the vine.
Melanie, one thing I wanted to just piggyback on what you said is the importance of bringing a project from start to finish. You had mentioned before that there's this sort of POC or pilot purgatory that organizations find themselves in. Can you speak a little bit to that, and also how you can vision avoiding such scenario?
Yeah, so yeah, absolutely. So that was kind of what I was mentioning before, which is if you don't have an executive sponsor, like if you don't have the support, if you don't have the budget, if you don't have the infrastructure in place, but really the number one thing, as I was mentioning through the presentation, is the business case. Like if you're just implementing an AI model to implement an AI model to say you did an innovation check mark, it won't go anywhere, right? So there has to be a compelling reason for people to want to use your tool, or to want to use, sorry, not your tool, but your service, right? So if you're creating a new service or improving a service, it's really important that you have that end game in mind, so that you can work backwards in all the steps in terms of how we're going to get there. Okay, so we're going to need, you know, potentially a partner to help us get there, like a Triad or IBM or whoever, to help us walk through those lessons learned, to make sure that we are able to absorb, that we have the even the expertise in house to be able to maintain it. So if you think about it, if you're getting an off-the-shelf product like an ERP, as an example, say you're implementing Maximo or SAP or something, well, you know, that's fine, because once you've implemented it, you have a vendor that you can go to for tech support. But if you're implementing like an AI model, you actually have to think about it as a program, right? It's not just a product that you're implementing once and then you walk away. So you do have to kind of build that support model through and a life cycle model throughout that implementation as well, right? You have to think about, how are we going to support this moving forward, so that it's not like this little pilot, we proved it out and now it's dead. It's okay, the business case, we're going to see an ROI of X amount in the next 2 years, because we are going to, you know, it's going to potentially replace a very manual process today, or we're going to, you know, expand our service. And so having that executive support, having the process in place, and maybe a partner to help you get there, are all really great steps to making sure that you are not in pilot purgatory, right? That you have the right tools to expand.
And the last comment that I'll make is, if you have a true pain point and people understand this is going to solve their pain point, that seems to be the thing that gets it over the line. You know, people become very anxious to get those pain points solved. So that also moves the project forward in a way that, it just accelerates things.
100%. That's the business case, right? Like, what's your business case? And if you saw like the chart that I was presenting on a Gartner, that's the number one. Exactly, Deborah, like on, you know, that's the number one issue in being able to bring these projects to scale. It's the pain point, right? It's that use case as to what are we actually solving for? Because it's just a tool. Like, it's not, AI is not the end. It's a means to an end, right? So hopefully
Great point. All right, I think we have time for one more question today. This is a biggie, so interested to hear your thoughts on this. Does AI open up security concerns that we need to start considering?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of examples that you've probably even read in the media, where everything from IP to you know, it's the data again, like, you know, exposing your data. For instance, one of the challenges that the federal government right now in Canada, they are trying to ensure that as you are inputting data into an open model like ChatGPT, that data is now belongs to OpenAI, right? And so your information is no longer secure. That's why it's so important, because the OpenAI can then use that data to train its new models. It is now part of that ecosystem of that is the foundation of that Gen AI model, right? And so it's part of it is the data, part of it is you know, the explainability, ensuring that you have. Now, the flip side of that is there's a lot of opportunity in AI being used within SOCs today to ensure that there's actually better visibility in catching any kind of security breaches within an organization. So AI is also helping to improve security. I know that's not that was the question, but there's also opportunities there around security with AI
Great point.
and how it's being used today. But yeah, absolutely.
Point. All right, fantastic. Well, we are headed to the top of the hour, so I want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar, and a very special thank you to our three presenters today, Mike Riggs, Melanie Gilbert, and Deborah Walker, for joining us today and providing your insights. We look forward to following up with you in the new year. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.